Hey everyone, welcome to another topic video. Recently, Kane B on his channel had an interesting conversation with Philip Goff regarding objective value. I'll link that video in the description. I thought it was a rather respectful and fruitful discussion, and it was nice seeing Goff talk about something outside of his primary philosophical interest, philosophy of mind. And Goff has subsequently written a short blog post pushing sort of argument relevant to that discussion. I want to talk about those things in this video, although I won't talk about everything that they discussed. And because it's relevant, I'm also going to use this as a sort of jumping off point to talk about some of my other views about moral and evaluative facts more generally. Since this is a large topic, of course, many relevant things will be left unsaid for another day, perhaps. Now, Goff brings up the example of the person whose primary life goal is to count blades of grass. This is what they care about most. All other goals, should they have any, are secondary to that. The example here originally comes from John Rawls, although similar examples have been mentioned in the literature, for example, those involving mud saucers, balls of string, and so on. I should note, Goff's use of this example differs a little bit from Rawls' original presentation by supposing that the desire is welfare irrelevant. That is, that the person who has this desire has it regardless the suffering or boredom it might lead to, and perhaps they know it might lead to it. And this is not how Rawls originally intended it. But the discussion here isn't really about Rawls or the literature that example sparked specifically. And so we can grant Goff his example. It is at least conceivable, if strange, that someone would have the primary life goal to count blades of grass, regardless what that might lead to in terms of suffering, boredom, and other sorts of states or experiences. I mean, there might be some residual concerns about what attitudes or lack thereof are consistent with having a desire in this way, and what exactly a desire consists in more generally. But it doesn't seem to me that relevant to the debate over objective values, and I'm just kind of happy to gloss over this and grant that the grass counting desire, or something near enough, is possible as Goff describes it. Now, Goff suggests that he has the intuition, an enormously strong intuition at that there are stance-independent facts about what values and goals are valuable, worthwhile, and so forth. Now, that is to say, for example, he thinks that some goals are really worth having, and that they're worth having not because of any stances, desires, or any other attitudes, real or hypothetical, of subjects more generally. I mean, it's an objective feature of the world. That's just the way it is, regardless whether we think it that way or not. Now, his intuition that this is so strong that it's similar in strength to his intuition that there's an external world. Of course, this intuition is not unique to Goff. It's intuition about objective value. But I will not. But I'm going to continue to talk about his position for sake of discussion. Now, he remarks that Kane doesn't share this intuition, even in the slightest. Kane grants that Goff has the intuition, and being fairly permissive epistemically, is willing to grant that Goff is justified in some sense in taking his intuition as veridical, as guiding him toward the truth. Personally, however, I do not even go that far. I have little idea what this intuition is supposed to be in the first place. You can say, well, it's just intuition, that there are stance-independent facts about which goals are valuable or not valuable, and so on. But this is of little help to me. What does it mean to be valuable here? Apparently, it's a predicate which can be applied to persons, attitudes, objects, states of affairs, and perhaps other things, and bears some relation to reactive attitudes. But what these and a kind of web of other related terms mean, what they're just talking about beyond this, is kind of simply mysterious to me. What does it mean for a reactive attitude to be appropriate to some action in the realist intended sense? Similarly, what does it mean for an action or attitude to be right or wrong or virtuous or obligatory or permissible or impermissible or supererogatory and so on? To be clear, I can understand to some degree what these terms are relevant to: actions, attitudes, objects, etc. I can understand some of their grammatical and syntactical features. I can report how these terms relate semantically to each other, according to at least typical philosophical usage. I mean, I can report, for example, that an impermissible action is not a permissible action. Right? These are supposed to be exclusive categories. But in doing so, I find myself doing little more than shuffling symbols around in ways according with certain linguistic conventions. You know, and I say this as someone who has a, I would say, decent understanding of moral philosophy, both historical and contemporary, and as someone who has reflected and introspected significantly on my understanding of the terms. By analogy, suppose someone told you that the Gostak distims the doshes. Right? You might be able to infer that distimming is an action that Gostak can do to doshes. But would that be enough for you to know what distimming is? Would you know how to identify it in the world? Could you relate the term in substantive ways to other terms or concepts you already possess? I mean, I would say no, right? But this is more or less the position I find myself in with regard to moral and evaluative realist vocabulary. Right? I mean, really reflect. I wonder what viewers think. Do you understand what the terms mean? Right? To say that, for example, some goal is objectively worthwhile or not worthwhile. I don't understand what that means. Does my response here resonate with you upon consideration? I mean, I'm genuinely interested to see. So before returning to Goff's points, I want to make three important remarks about the position I've stated here. First, this is primarily a comment on my own psychology, not on the psychology of people or realists more generally. Other people, perhaps many others, understand these terms in a way that I don't. To use the analogy, people might use the term Gostak to refer to things without issue. In principle, something similar could be said of moral or evaluative terms. Ideally, someone would be able to communicate those terms to me, similarly to how someone might in the case of Gostaks. But even if they are unable to do so, as has been my experience so far, that wouldn't entail that they do not themselves understand the terms perfectly well, although it might be some indication of it. In some, although I'm somewhat doubtful of this for other reasons, it could be that I'm conceptually deficient, or even that I do possess the relevant moral and evaluative concepts and yet simply fail to recognize them as such for some reason. Second, I'm not saying that I think that moral or evaluative realism is false. For the sake of the discussion here, at least, it's entirely consistent with what I've said, that moral and evaluative realists do use the terms in meaningful and factful ways. If Gostak denoted black cats, for example, then Gostaks would exist regardless whether I understood the term. And moreover, extensionally speaking, I could think that Gostaks exist, since I think that black cats exist, even if I don't know that the word Gostak denotes black cats. Something similar in principle could be claimed about moral and evaluative facts. I could think, for example, that some things are stance independently valuable as realists use the term, even if I don't know how the term is being used. Third, there are other ways in which these words can be used, and in ways in which I do use them, that I do understand. For example, I make comments quite frequently about morals, reasons, values, norms, etc., where what I'm talking about are attitudes, stances, features of those things, or the objects of them. To be clear, I'm not saying that I have an understanding of these terms, like good, bad, like right, wrong, and so on. As I'm not saying that I have an understanding of these terms that's neutral between a realist and an anti-realist reading, right? Rather, the terms as I'm using them just means something stance dependent. That's what I have in mind when I'm using the terms in a meaningful way. Now, of course, I take it that realists are at least typically not using them in that way, right? Since that would require that they think there are stance dependent facts of a certain sort. And that's not a belief reasonably attributed to them, generally speaking, anyway. And so what I'm kind of forced to conclude is that I have an understanding of these terms that I use, and it differs in some way from how the realist uses them. I don't know how they use them, if they're using them intelligibly at all. Now, the fact that I use the same sounds and symbols as the realist, yet we typically use them in different ways, I mean, that's going to be partly an accident of linguistic history. I suspect it's primarily because the words, as we've both come to learn to use them, serve similar social and functional roles. But regardless, the point is, I bring this up to preempt the objection that since I understand what stance-dependent morals and evaluations are, and I understand what stance independence means versus stance dependence, I should thereby also understand what stance-independent morals and evaluations are. To repeat, the mistake of this objection is that when I say that I understand what stance-dependent morals and evaluations are, I am using the words moral and evaluations in a way distinct from how the realist at least typically uses them. And so I don't understand what they mean when they use them in that way. Now, a lot more can be said on each of these points, but for brevity, I'm going to save it for another time. Let's return to Philip Goff and objective value. Again, my basic response regarding his intuition is that I just don't understand what the intuition is supposed to be. He says that certain aims are worth having objectively. What are you saying? What are you committing to about those aims? Can you put it in other terms? Can you express the concept in a way that sort of intelligible? Because I haven't heard it. I don't know what it's supposed to be. Now, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have the intuition or that he isn't justified in taking it to be vertical. More importantly, however, I think I can account for the attitudes and responses that I have regarding the grass counter case without needing to appeal to anything else. So I don't care to count blades of grass, and I may even care to try to convince other people not to do so. Take the child whose primary life goal is to count blades of grass. If they want that child to have certain experiences, happiness, relationships, and engage in other sorts of pursuits, as I probably would, and I care about those things more than allowing them to follow their aims in this particular case, then I may look to convince them to explore other things or even prevent them from acting on their grass counting goal. What more do we need to make sense of the differences in my responses or attitudes? What more for anyone else? I'm committed to facts about the child, the desires they have, and so on. And I have my various preferences and attitudes about them and their desires. For those who understand what objective values are supposed to be, would you say that I'm at least implicitly committed to them? What role could they play in explaining my attitudes in this case? What role do they play in explaining your attitudes in this case? I'm kind of doubtful that there is one. You're still going to act on the basis of your desires in this case, as I am. Now, in his blog post, Goff presents his point as a simple sort of argument. Suppose there is one child whose primary life goal is to pursue playing football, something you'd prefer that they not do, and a younger child whose primary life goal is to count blades of grass. The argument is then given as follows. Premise one: anyone who would judge concern and intervention as reasonable in the case of the younger child, but unreasonable in the case of the old child, implicitly believes in objective values. Premise two: almost everyone would judge concern and intervention reasonable in the case of the younger child, but unreasonable in the case of the older child. conclusion, almost everyone implicitly believes in objective values. Now, strictly speaking, since I don't understand what objective values are supposed to be, I cannot really assess the first premise. Still, I want to speak briefly on what work reasonableness is doing in this argument. What does reasonable imply here? If it's meant to express some stance-independent normative fact, then I'm similarly ill-equipped to assess that part of the argument. I have little idea what that is supposed to mean. If reasonableness is something kind of fixed by stances or attitudes, individual or otherwise, then I can understand that. Concern about or intervention in the goals of the younger child, but not the older, is reasonable to me in the sense that doing so accords with my preferences and goals. Right, I care more to prevent the younger child from following that aim because of other attitudes I have than I do about the older child and their aim. Now, we might also say that this reaction is reasonable in the sense that it accords with common social practice regarding these matters. I mean, there are different ways that we might use the word reasonable here. Of course, and I just gave a couple that I sometimes use that I do understand. And if the term is being used in one of these ways or something similar, then of course I would assess the described concern or intervention reasonable in the case of the younger, not the older. And I judge it so merely because it accords with the other goals and desires that I have, or something like that. No other stance-independent facts seem relevant to this judgment. And so a fortiori, no stance-independent moral or evaluative facts seem relevant, whatever those are supposed to be. To sum up, Goff claims to have the very strong intuition that some things and some goals are stance-independently more or less valuable than others. Some are really worth pursuing, and some really are not. Some anti-realists will admit that they have this intuition, but think it's false for other reasons. Others, like Kane, will deny that they have it. That they have it. Myself, I don't even understand what the intuition is supposed to be. At the very least, though, this sort of language seems irrelevant to capturing my attitudes or commitments regarding the case at hand. I would intervene in the aims of the younger child, if I would, because I want them to be happy, or because I want them to have certain experiences or contribute in other ways, or something else like that. And it's facts like these, facts about my attitudes and preferences, that appear to be adequate to explain why I would intervene in the case of one and not the other. I wouldn't intervene in the case of the older child because even though I would prefer that they not pursue football, perhaps, I don't prefer it so much that I would want to intervene on their goals. I care about letting them follow what they are passionate about and so on. And in this case, my preference that they not pursue football does not overwhelm that preference to let them follow the goal. So perhaps when the realist says that there are objective values, they say something true. I mean, in principle, it could be that they even commit to something I might agree exists. But I just don't know what that is. And I struggle to see what explanatory relevance it could even have to my attitudes regarding the goals of myself and others. If pressed, I would probably guess that realists generally do not have anything particularly intelligible in mind when they employ moral and evaluative language. But I've not argued for that here. In any event, that's going to do it for today. Hope you got something out of this. Thanks everyone for liking and subscribing. And if you'd like to support the creation of more content like this and get some cool perks, then yeah, please consider contributing at patreon.com/friction.